This is part 2 of the introductory lecture to The Circle. We will now review the novel genre and features associated with this book. So this book is primarily an example of dystopian fiction. Dystopian is a critique of utopian idealism and pursuits. So whenever we say this is a dystopian novel, it's a critique of something that exists already. And in a dystopian novel, it often imagines a future world of oppression, conformity, and authoritarian states. This is the most common kind of vein that runs through dystopian work. A good example of this, of course, is George Orwell's 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, referenced already, as well as like the young adult novels, the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins, or the Divergent series by Veronica Roth. All of these imagine a kind of apocalyptic future wherein the state exerts lots and lots of control over the individual and everything is wrong. But how we get there, how we get to that dystopic frame is through utopian vision. Now, utopianism, in order to understand what dystopianism is, we have to understand that utopianism is an old philosophy espoused by influential figures across centuries. And when I say old, I mean it is as old as the ancient Greeks. So Plato is considered a utopian writer in the Republic. He's kind of a political utopian who posits that we can create the best and most ideal society when we put the philosopher as king and we assign everyone else their jobs. Thomas More is kind of considered a religious utopian with his book Utopia, created during the Renaissance. Thomas Hobbes is another political utopian who posits that the state needs to have centralized, strong authority because humans are bad, and so the state is the thing that can correct them. And finally, Karl Marx is another utopian who says, we could live in a perfect world if there just weren't any classes or there wasn't wealth disparity. So the way that we solve the problem of this thing, in Marx's case, the problem of being poor, is that we just take things away from the rich and we distribute them evenly across all classes. So there's always a problem that utopians are responding to, and they're saying if we just change this thing, if we just change that thing, if we get rid of this group of people, because that also falls in utopian thinking, then the world can be perfect. So at their core, utopian aspirations involve the perfectibility of humanity, right? So if only we could make the world a better and more perfect place by doing X, Y, Z, that's a very utopian way of thinking. So dystopian fiction exposes the follies of pursuing the perfect world and the ramifications of doing so. It's kind of the reality check, like, okay, so if we do this thing or we don't do this thing that you propose, then we will see these things happen as a result, because to pursue perfection is kind of a fool's errand. It's a way of thinking about dystopian fiction. Now, Margaret Atwood had a few things to say about this book, as you know, because you already read her review. And one of the lines that I think sums up nicely what's going on in this dystopian fiction book is that it is a novel of ideas about the social construction and deconstruction of privacy, and about the increasing corporate ownership of privacy, and about the effects such ownership may have on the nature of Western democracy. So privacy is often a value that is non-existent in a dystopian novel. 1984, Big Brother is always watching, but that comes from the state. And in this case, we have an example of another very powerful structure, like the corporation, for example, having just as much control over people who have willingly given over their rights to privacy in exchange for goods or services. So it's a little bit different, as we'll see that Eggers is working a little differently with the genre. So the first thing that Eggers does is he puts the dystopian genre in the here and the now. It's a present problem, not one that's projected for the future as a warning. Although there are warnings throughout the book, Eggers is responding to things that are happening now. He's responding to modern corollaries, we should say, in this book, and we'll talk about allegory in a moment. Eggers is also less concerned with state encroachment on the individual and more concerned with private entities encroaching on the individual. And maybe the fact that the individual doesn't really know that they're being encroached upon, or they're okay with it because of all the stuff they get in response. It employs elements of science fiction as well, with the focus on how the world of technology changes the human. So sci-fi as a genre is not just about space exploration and aliens, although those frequently do pop up in science fiction works. Science fiction broadly explores the relationship that humans have with science and artificial intelligence. How we are changed by technology, perhaps, is a concern raised by sci-fi. And so there are moments of science fictional elements in this dystopian book. So he blends the two genres. That's one of his approaches. And finally, it showcases the relationship between technological advancements and human agency, if there is any. And he raises the question of whether or not we can continue to have agency, have individual freedom, have autonomy as people when technology is such a huge part of our everyday lives, and technology necessarily comes with a sacrifice of privacy. Oh, and last but not least, it employs polyphony to explore different ideas throughout the book, which I'd like to take a moment to explain. So polyphony in writing refers to many voices that make up a text. Poly, of course, means many. Phony or phonic means voices, so many voices are going to have conversations in this novel. The third-person narrator will provide an interior experience in the character of May, so we get the most revealing sense of who she is as a character thanks to that omniscient narrator. But aside from those personal dives into May's character, we don't really get a deep dive into anyone else's. The result is that the outside voices that May interacts with represent ideas. They're not so much people everyone knows and recognizes. Maybe you've known people that hold similar views espoused by people at the circle, but they don't really act like regular human beings, in case you haven't picked up on that yet in your reading of the book. They're not terribly nuanced. In fact, that was one of the criticisms of the book, is that it's sort of this ham-fisted knock you over the head with a message book instead of, playing with shades of gray. But the more important thing is that every time one of those outside voices opens up its mouth, an idea pops out. And conversations between characters, especially characters with May, are debates between philosophies, and ones you will likely recognize as the novel progresses. What they talk about in this book is what we talk about all the time when it comes to the role new media plays in our lives. We talk about the value of the individual versus the group. At what point privacy is okay to sacrifice in favor of whatever you get in exchange for that privacy, whether it's a service, whether it's connection, it's communication. It might be school, for goodness sake. I mean, Questa needed to know your personal information to enroll in my class, but look what you get in response. You get the opportunity to learn how to write and how to think. There are reference points in this book with that polyphony that are all contemporary. So Google, Silicon Valley, social media, etc. These are all things that Eggers is referencing with that polyphony in the book. So that when Eamon Bailey, for example, gives a speech at work, we're supposed to kind of recognize it as, I think that's a TED Talk. And we really listen to a lot of TED Talks these days, don't we? And we uphold them as being very important pieces of public discourse. And what's Eggers saying about the TED Talk as a result? Now this brings us, of course, to allegory, where one thing references another thing. So allegory is a mode of storytelling that draws out comparisons. It's using one story to tell another. So there are allegorical elements in the circle wherein Eggers will portray something that happens, but there's a clear, in real life reference point for that thing that happens. So pay attention to that. Ask yourself what he's saying about the here and the now with the way he renders his fictional world. So back to the Bailey TED Talk example. What's Eggers commenting on when it comes to the way the crowd applauds and repeats back these slogans to Eamon Bailey as he wanders the stage looking like your friendly uncle who's really smart, the way so many TED Talk speakers do? Eggers has something to say about that. That's why it's a recognizable moment to us as an audience member. Now, metaphor is employed in allegorical storytelling mode. Within allegories, there are metaphors. Metaphor is the comparison between something literal and something figurative, where the literal takes on meaning beyond itself. There are lots of metaphors in this book, from sharks to other sea creatures to the little fitness device that May wears, to the kayaking scenes, to, what's another good metaphor to explain here? There are lots of them. Everything is pretty much metaphorical. Works of art in this, the architecture of the circle, you can kind of pick any physical object and say there's probably something metaphorical happening here. So get comfortable with the idea of reading into the book and not just reading it for those metaphors. And they're usually found within the book's motifs. So if something is recurrent throughout the book, like a repeating image, repeating pattern, repeating slogan, that's going to contain a metaphorical commentary that you should read into. Now, why are you reading a novel in a writing class? I just want to put this out there. So I have some justifications for including The Circle in English 201A as a book. Your task will be to determine the various arguments Eggers makes in the book and how he makes them, because this is largely a book about arguments and debates and philosophies, and there are messages that are not hard to pick out in this book. It's something that I find students really resonate with because it's highly relevant to their lives, especially if they choose to take an online class. I mean, we're sort of engaged in something the Circle would approve of just by being here and being enrolled in a simulation of a class, which is what English 201A is when it's conducted online. You will need to exercise more analytical muscles for this book. It's not so much about what you feel is going on or how you feel about the novel itself. Just like I didn't really care if you liked your advertisement or not, I don't really care if you like the book or you don't. I'm interested in seeing how you understand and interpret it in light of analysis. Now remember that your midterm will be on The Circle and it's worth 15% of your grade overall. That is how you will be accountable for this book and reading it all the way through. The first 50 or so questions of the midterm will be a mixture of objective and semi-analytical exercises. And then you will write an essay for the remaining question worth 100 points. So up till then you'll have about 50 points to play with, and then after that you'll have 100 points worth of writing wherein you will analyze something that's going on with the novel. So referencing back to this lecture in preparation for that is a good move. Marking off important passages as we go through them is an important thing. Referring back to class discussions that we have in the discussion board posts where, especially where I might weigh in and say, hey, pay attention to this passage. A lot of reading is what you have ahead of you in the next few weeks to get ready for analyzing this book on the midterm. So with that, we will take our first steps into a discussion on The Circle. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for next week.